At age 60, Reggie Miller stands as a quiet milestone in NBA history, a man who left a mark so deep that it doesn't need repeating to be unforgettable. Over nearly 2 decades in an Indiana Pacers uniform, he was the face of a franchise that was never considered a power center, yet always showed up for the biggest moments. Those ice-cold three-pointers amid the boos, those off-ball runs to exhaustion, those free-throw lines where the whole arena waited for him to crumble, and he didn't. He reached the NBA Finals, dragged the Pacers past giants multiple times, became a clutch icon before the term got branded and worshipped. He was once the all-time leader in threes, represented the U.S. at the Olympics, walked into the Hall of Fame, not on a ring but on the quiet respect of people who understand the game. Reggie Miller's achievements didn't come from dominance, but from ruthless persistence, from surviving and winning in conditions that were never on his side. But once the trophy list ends, the pain shows up. No big retirement ceremony for him, no new banner raised. Madison Square Garden, which once hated him with a passion, now just shrugs. The NBA talks about other names, other eras, and Reggie Miller fades into a blurry memory for a generation that never saw how much he was despised, and still stood tall. His pain isn't in losing, it's in paying for every step forward, without ever being promised a reward. His body carries the wear of all those off-ball years. His mind carries the memory of always being doubted, always having to prove, always enduring in silence. And from that, Reggie Miller's will emerges clearer than any accolade, a will that doesn't demand fair history, doesn't beg for recognition, just quietly exists, as a reminder that some people do everything right, walk the hardest path, don't break, don't run, even knowing history might never pay them back what they're worth. If this story makes you pause for a beat and see Reggie Miller from a different angle, hit subscribe to keep riding with us through the next chapters. Reggie Miller didn't step into life with the balance people usually tag on to great athletes. From the early years, his body carried a ruthless reminder that everything would be slower, hurt more, and be harder than for others. Congenital hip dysplasia tied his childhood to clinics, to endless checkups, to heavy leg braces that clamped around legs that were still tender. While other kids ran and jumped on instinct, learned to fall and bounce back laughing, Reggie learned to stand straight, learned to place each foot on the floor with the least pain, learned to wait. The pain didn't come as one hit, but as a constant presence, quiet but persistent, enough to shape his whole rhythm. Every morning he woke up, before even thinking about playtime or school, he had to face his own body, a body that always whispered that today wouldn't be easy. His first awareness of "I'm not normal" didn't come from someone else's words, but from the most natural kid comparison, looking at other legs flying light and easy, while his lagged heavy, cautious. No one meant to hurt him, but the adult's silence, those pity-worried glances, accidentally taught him that expectations for him were lower. Reggie learned early what it felt like to be left behind, not for lack of trying, but because his body wouldn't allow it. Rare play sessions ended with him sitting first, panting, hearing his heartbeat like a warning. The body became his first betrayer, an opponent he couldn't dodge. It forced him to negotiate every day, to accept that to do what others called normal, he'd have to pay more. In those years, Reggie learned to endure without complaining, because complaining didn't make the pain vanish. When basketball showed up, it didn't arrive as a saving dream. It felt more like a challenge, even a bitter paradox, a sport that demands constant running, jumping, cutting, attracting a kid who'd learned to walk in braces. But Reggie didn't see the contradiction as a reason to back off. Instead, he saw it as the fairest test. If he could exist there, he'd know how strong he really was. Those first court runs didn't feel like freedom, they felt like caution. Every landing was a silent question: can the body take one more? No cheers, no scoreboard, just focus, and a low hum of fear that pain could seize control any time. Before he learned to shoot, Reggie learned to listen to his body, learned to keep going even if tomorrow wasn't certain. Before he understood winning, he got used to not being chosen, not favored, not promised. Reggie Miller's tragedy didn't need a dramatic crash to begin. It built up from aching mornings, from slow steps, from the quiet knowledge that every gain came at a cost. There, fate laid the foundation for a life with no shortcuts, where every meter forward was the product of prolonged endurance, and before he could even name his love for the orange ball, before crowds and lights appeared, destiny had quietly carved into that boy a truth he couldn't deny. His body would always test him, and the tragedy would always start way too early. In the Miller house, waiting wasn't an option for the weak. The home where Reggie Miller grew up wasn't short on material love, but it overflowed with discipline and the cold standards of winning. At the center of every comparison stood Cheryl Miller, the big sister, not just better, but so superior that every other effort got overshadowed. Cheryl won like it was natural law. She scored, grabbed trophies, got cheered at school, on the court, in the grown-up stories told with unhidden pride. Cheryl's success needed no explanation, no defense. It was clear, bright, unquestioned. In that same space, Reggie existed like a sour note, the younger brother, smaller, weaker, slower, carrying an imperfect body and careful runs, always next to a standard he couldn't reach. The comparison didn't need words. It lived in glances, in the way people expected Cheryl to shine, and only hoped Reggie wouldn't mess up. No one was mean about it, but that silence created more pressure than any scolding. Reggie lost not just in the backyard games, but inside his own home, where winning was the only measure of worth. Kid matches between siblings never ended the same way. Cheryl always stood tall, while Reggie hung his head, breathed hard, swallowed disappointment. No "you tried hard" consolations, no encouraging head pats. The Miller family believed in training by reality, and reality said Reggie wasn't good enough yet. Every loss taught him one thing: tears don't change scores. No one stopped to let him catch up. Life moved on, and he had to choose, keep up or get left. That harshness didn't look violent or bitter. It was a quiet cold. It taught Reggie that no one owed him emotional support. If he wanted to be seen, he had to stand up himself. Over time, Reggie learned to hide disappointment, learned not to ask for praise, because praise, if it came, always arrived late, compared to Cheryl's. At family dinners, stories of her wins buzzed with energy, while Reggie's tales, if told, were just scraps, not enough to hold attention. He listened, remembered, and carved into himself a painful lesson in this world. Even in family, love often comes tied to achievement, and if there's no achievement, best not to ask. In that environment, Reggie formed a quiet but solid inner core. Constant losing didn't make him resent Cheryl, didn't make him rebel against the family. Instead, he turned the failure inward, made it a private fuel. Every defeat, he didn't ask why she was better, he asked what he still lacked. But that question didn't lead to easy answers. It led to accepting that he might always have to try harder, just to get a fraction of what others took for granted. Reggie learned to swallow tears young, not because he didn't hurt, but because he knew tears gave no edge. He learned to be quiet in disappointment, learned to stand without anyone pulling him up. Those lessons weren't spoken, they were hammered in by relentless repetition of failure. The Miller family didn't mean to create a tragedy, but their worship of winning had accidentally placed Reggie in a position where he always had to chase. He grew up feeling he always came second, always had to prove, always had to make up for it. And that etched into Reggie a quality that would stay with him for life: no demanding sympathy, no expecting favoritism. If he wanted to exist, he'd do it on his own power, even if the road was longer, lonelier. In that home that didn't wait for the weak, Reggie Miller wasn't shielded from failure, but he also wasn't allowed to fall, and from those defeats right inside his own family, a quiet will formed, not loud, not shown off, but tough enough that later, an entire league had to remember. When he stepped onto the UCLA Bruins, Reggie Miller didn't arrive with the story of a highly anticipated star. He was just a player with undefined potential. He played well, even very well in practices and games, but every comment always stopped at a cold boundary: good enough, not special enough. On scouting reports, Reggie was rarely labeled a star. Instead, there were the same ruthless, repeated descriptions: just a shooter, not strong enough, lacks the frame for the highest level. In an environment where power and size were the common language, Reggie spoke a different one: precise but quiet, and for that reason easy to overlook. He scored, he kept the pace, He ran off ball to exhaustion, but when the spotlight searched for a face to represent, it rarely lingered on him. Reggie gradually got used to being seen as a backup option, as a replaceable piece, never the center of any long-term plan. Praise, when it came, usually arrived with conditions, as if someone was trying to reassure themselves more than acknowledge his worth. In discussions, the name Reggie Miller was rarely the first one mentioned, and that very silence gnawed at his self-worth in the slowest but deepest way. In very private moments, he began to wonder if he truly deserved to be there, not just physically on the court, but as someone trusted, expected, seen as the future. Those questions weren't loud, didn't explode into rebellion. They crept into his mind every time he sat on the bench, every time another player got a chance he thought he deserved too. Reggie never lacked effort, but his effort always seemed to need an extra defense. The feeling became so familiar, he stopped being surprised when it showed up. Instead of chasing recognition, Reggie started forming a different habit, proving in silence. He practiced more, ran more, repeated drills others called monotonous. Every shot wasn't just for points, it was a quiet rebuttal to those who doubted. He didn't argue, didn't demand a role, didn't beg for more looks. He let basketball speak for him, even knowing that voice wasn't always heard. The years at UCLA didn't turn Reggie into a star, but they carved into him a lasting wound, the feeling of always having to prove his value, even when he'd done everything right. The lack of trust didn't break him, but it created a gap where he doubted himself before believing in himself. It was a kind of pain hard to name, because it didn't come from clear failure, it came from success still not being enough. Reggie learned to live with that feeling, learned not to expect confirmation from the outside. He accepted his place as someone who always had to take one extra step to be seen, and in that silence, a survival instinct took shape. If no one believes, he'll believe himself. If no one calls his name, he'll let his actions speak. UCLA didn't grant Reggie Miller the title of star, but it left a deeper mark, the habit of enduring doubt without losing discipline, the habit of moving forward, without needing applause. The wounds to his self-worth didn't vanish when he left campus. They followed him, quiet but persistent, becoming part of who he was, preparing him for an even harsher journey, where the doubt wouldn't come just from a few coaches or teammates, but from an entire league ready to turn its back on anyone who didn't fit the mold. The moment that should have been the reward for a childhood of endurance, and a youth spent constantly proving himself instead, became the first public blow that drove home Reggie Miller's feeling of collective rejection. The NBA draft in 1987 didn't open with applause for him. It opened with boos ringing out right inside the arena, where he'd just been selected. The Indiana Pacers called Reggie Miller's name at the 11th pick, and the crowd's reaction was almost instant. They didn't want him. Not cold silence, but loud, open, unhidden opposition. It wasn't gentle skepticism about potential, it was a collective statement: this is a mistake. Reggie stood there, skinny frame, shoulders slightly hunched, face trying to stay calm. But inside, an old wound had just been ripped open again. He'd grown used to being underrated, but never to being rejected by thousands of people at once. The draft wasn't just a professional formality, it was the public birth ceremony of a player. And in that ceremony, Reggie Miller was born as an unwelcome child. No one stood to clap. No one said "we believe in you." Just doubting eyes and rejecting noise sealing his fate. You don't belong here. In those first days stepping into the Pacers' locker room, that feeling didn't disappear. It followed him into every practice, every shooting drill, every off-ball run. Reggie wasn't seen as a piece of the future, he was seen as a decision that needed justifying. He heard the whispers: just a shooter, not strong enough, won't survive the NBA. Every comment was a reminder that his presence was temporary, conditional, revocable at any time. For another player, that might have been just competitive fuel. For Reggie, it was brutal confirmation of the fear he'd carried since childhood, that he was always second choice, third choice, or a mistake to be corrected. He didn't enter the NBA feeling chosen. He entered feeling like he had to beg to exist. Every minute on the floor wasn't an opportunity to shine. It was a test. Do you deserve to be here? The loneliness started there. not loneliness from lacking teammates, but from lacking trust. Reggie learned not to expect encouragement. He learned to train in silence, to memorize every doubt like a list of things to disprove with action, but the price was emotional withdrawal. When you're rejected from day one, you don't allow yourself weakness, and you don't allow yourself to need anyone. Reggie Miller began building an inner fortress, where only discipline, obsession, and raw survival will lived. Those early career years weren't a path of glory, they were a string of days proving existence to eyes waiting for failure. Every miss brought the whispers back. See, every make was just a temporary stay of execution. No forgiveness, no safe zone. He lived in a state of constant correctness, because one slip and the draft mistake story would resurface. The most painful part wasn't the booze, it was the feeling of not belonging where home was supposed to be. The Pacers were the team that picked him, but not the team that believed in him from the start. And Reggie understood that difference perfectly. It kept him never comfortable, never able to stop. While others practiced to improve, he practiced to survive. While others dreamed of titles, he dreamed of not being replaced. The seed of long-term isolation was planted in that draft. It grew with every season, every game, every moment. Reggie had to remind himself that no one here owed him patience. He'd have to create his own value, shot by shot, run by run, second by second on the court. Not to be loved, but to not be discarded. And in that public adversity, a paradox began to form. Seen as a mistake, Reggie Miller gradually became someone who wouldn't allow himself to make one. Booed, he learned to turn hostility into fuel. Collectively rejected, he forged a will so solitary, it was ruthless. But the price was decades of enduring loneliness, where every win carried the bitterness of having to prove it all over again. The NBA draft didn't give Reggie Miller starting pride, it gave him a burden, a label, and a fight he was never allowed to escape. Those first years in the NBA didn't open a straight road for Reggie Miller, they opened a narrow corridor where every step was scrutinized. He had to run more than others, not just to score, but to stay on the floor. Practices ran longer, shooting reps multiplied. Every off-ball sprint was a silent negotiation with eyes that had never truly believed. With the Indiana Pacers, Reggie had no protection from reputation, no favoritism from status. He had no right to be wrong. One foul, one miss, one mistimed moment, was enough for the draft mistake story to tick back like a clock that refused to stop. So Reggie ran to create space for teammates, ran to wear down opponents, ran to prove that even without the frame, he could survive on sheer relentless endurance. No one shielded him from contact. No one pulled him out of rough defensive plays. Reggie understood his body wasn't the league's priority, that the fragility from childhood still cast a long shadow. Every fall was a warning, every stand-up a decision to keep paying the price. He didn't call for sympathy, because sympathy didn't earn him more minutes. He just quietly got up, caught his breath, and ran again. In that world, every shot wasn't just for points, it was a defense of his presence. Ball through the net was an argument, ball out was a suspended sentence. Reggie shot with the precision of someone who knew the tiniest deviation could be magnified into a reason to cut him. Success came to him in a very different way. Not explosive nights that forced the league to change its tone, but small, steady, hard-to-notice contributions. A stretch of the defense, a cut into a blind spot, a timely make but not under the lights. Each one helped him survive one more game, one more week, one more season, but it was never enough to erase the doubt. While others got praised for potential, Reggie only got credit for not messing up. While others got room to experiment, Reggie had to be optimal. That difference piled up like sand in his shoes, not painful enough to stop, but uncomfortable enough to grind down every step. Mental fatigue didn't arrive in one night, it built through long flights, repeated hotels, mornings waking up knowing he had to prove it all again from scratch. Reggie carried an invisible list of things to avoid. Don't miss too much, don't foul early, don't let opponents exploit. Every game was a test of professional ethics, where he had to maintain absolute discipline just to keep being there. And that discipline stretched too long became a burden, because living under doubt means never getting to relax. There were nights Reggie scored enough to win the game, but when he left the floor, he didn't feel relief. Victory only postponed tomorrow's question. He understood his career wasn't built on trust, it was built on temporary irreplaceability. That was a subtle but cruel difference. It made every success carry the anxiety of the next failure. It made joy always diluted by the duty to repeat. Reggie didn't complain. He didn't make a habit of blaming others. But silence didn't mean no pain. Mental exhaustion slipped into the smallest gaps, in rare rest moments, in dead ball seconds, in glances at the scoreboard, knowing that even when ahead, he still wasn't safe. He learned to hide the depletion, because showing it gained nothing. The more doubted, the more he withdrew, the more he worked. That loop fed itself. Existing in doubt is a form of prolonged fighting. It has no clear climax, no moment of release. It just has days connecting to days, where Reggie Miller keeps running, keeps shooting, keeps defending his right to stay. And that very wear and tear, quiet, undramatic, etched a special mark on his career. A man not allowed to be tired, yet still tired. Not allowed to be wrong, yet still forced to live with the fear of being wrong. In that world, Reggie understood very clearly that he wasn't paid back with peace of mind. The only reward for being right was the chance to be right one more time. There are places where an athlete is welcomed, and there are places where a person gets permanently labeled. For Reggie Miller, Madison Square Garden wasn't just an arena. It was a magnifying mirror for every contradiction inside him. The place where years of accumulated doubt exploded into open hatred. There, Reggie wasn't seen as just another opposing player. He was assigned a sharper, harder-to-wash role, villain. Every time the Pacers set foot in New York, the boos didn't need warming up. They poured down like a reflex, as if the crowd had been waiting to remind him that here, he was never forgiven. The taunts, the personal insults, the hostile gestures weren't aimed at his skills. They were aimed straight at his existence on the court. Reggie stood in that atmosphere, skinny, no frame, no intimidation factor, yet became the target of collective rage. And in that hostility, a paradox formed: he was only truly seen when he was hated. No one loved Reggie Miller at Madison Square Garden, but everyone knew exactly who he was. Reggie understood the rules of that place perfectly. He knew that if he just endured in silence, he'd be swallowed whole, so he chose to confront, not with muscle or collisions, but with calculated provocation, a direct stare into the stands, a small but sharp gesture, a cold smile after a shot swished clean through the net. That wasn't impulsiveness, it was survival strategy. When the world has decided to hate you, you have nothing left to lose by reflecting that hostility back. Reggie didn't beg to be loved, he forced himself to be remembered. Every shot in New York carried an extra layer of meaning, not just points, but a challenge thrown at tens of thousands, hoping for his failure. And when the ball dropped through, the noise erupted, not in joy but in fury. Reggie felt the strange power of that moment. He could silence an entire city with just a few seconds of precision. Winning at Madison Square Garden was never light. It was prolonged emotional combat, where every passing minute stretched tight like a guitar string. Reggie ran off ball through curses, changed direction in thick waves of sound, shot with his heart rate pulled taut by the surrounding hate. In that place, he wasn't just battling 5 opponents, he was battling an entire arena. And the most painful part was that he understood they hated him, not because he cheated, not because he was wrong, but because he dared to exist without their permission. Reggie wasn't built to be New York's hero. He was forged into the disruptor, the one who dared smile through boos, the one who dared poke at a city's pride that was used to being worshipped. The peak moments at Madison Square Garden, those game-deciding shots, those scoring runs that panicked opponents, froze time in a cruel way. Reggie didn't celebrate with excitement, he celebrated with coldness. A choked gesture, a challenging glare, a straight posture amid a roaring sea of people. That was how he took revenge on the world that had doubted and rejected him. Not with violence, but with precision. Not with words, but with results. But every time he also etched deeper an irreversible label, the hated one. And in sports, being hated can mean fame, but it rarely means being loved. The price of becoming the perfect villain was loneliness. Reggie left Madison Square Garden, not with acknowledgement, but with the heavy memory of nights he had to win amid hate. The booze didn't follow him to the locker room, but the feeling of denial did. He knew those moments would be replayed, rebroadcast, retold as anecdotes, but rarely with empathy. History loves beloved heroes. It tolerates villains only for drama. Reggie Miller somehow got stuck in between, remembered as the one who made New York tremble, but not loved as the one who paid with prolonged isolation. At Madison Square Garden, Reggie found the peak of opposing emotion, and also the limit of recognition. He could beat opponents, silence crowds, create unforgettable moments, but when he left, he was still the one who didn't belong there. And that sense of not belonging followed him throughout his career, turning every win into a double-edged blade, sharp, memorable, but cold. Reggie Miller is remembered by history for those nights in New York, but between memory and love there is always a gap, and he, with all his composure and coldness, stood his entire life in that gap. The label clutch didn't come to Reggie Miller as a reward, it came as a prolonged sentence. It tied him to historic moments, but at the same time bound him to a ruthless expectation: no room to fail. When the game reached its final minutes, when the scoreboard tightened like a noose, every eye turned to him, not because he was the biggest, strongest, or most protected, but because he was the only one willing to step up. In those seconds, Reggie had no teammates to shoulder the pressure for him. He was the destination for collective fear and fragile hope, the convergence point for every last pass. His shots didn't just decide games, they decided how history would recount that moment. And so every time the ball left his hands, it wasn't simply a technical motion, it was a silent vow that he would take responsibility for it all. The historic moments replayed over and over: the corner three, the off-ball run escaping traps, the free throws amid deafening noise, froze time in a very particular way. For fans it was glory. For Reggie, it was absolute focus to the point of isolation. He had to empty his mind, strangle every doubt, every fear, so his body could execute what had been programmed. But that programming wasn't free. It demanded thousands of repetitions in practice, runs to exhaustion, sleepless nights replaying every possible failure scenario. The pressure to not fail turned preparation into obsession, and obsession stretched long enough becomes loneliness. No one talks about the minutes before the clutch moment. In those minutes, Reggie stood there, listening to his own heartbeat drown out the cheers. He knew that if he missed, the narrative would flip instantly. Hero would become mistake. There was no buffer for someone always doubted. No excuse for the man handed the last shot, so Reggie learned to accept a cold truth: his glory didn't bring peace. It only bought one more temporary vote of trust. Tomorrow the loop would start again. Another game, another final minute, another shot that had to go in. Victory arrived, crowds erupted, locker rooms buzzed. But when the noise faded, Reggie returned to his body, a body that had paid for every precise moment: tense muscles, aching knees, unexplained bruises. Off-ball running was his art, but also his silent erosion. He ran to create space, ran to stretch defenses, ran to manufacture his own chances. Over the years, every step drained energy that was never replenished. The body remembers everything. It keeps tally of every landing, every hard stop, every uncalled collision, and eventually it starts collecting debt. The mind wears down in its own way too. Living in clutch means always keeping yourself on the sharpest edge. No slacking, no letting go. Reggie learned to push emotions aside: joy, sadness, complacency, because any of them could throw off the rhythm. He became cold, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Cold to survive, cold to not break under booze, under provocation, under dumped responsibility. But that coldness didn't vanish when he left the court. It followed him to the locker room, to the hotel, to restless nights. Winning didn't bring deep sleep, it brought vigilance. There is a bitter paradox in Reggie Miller's clutch moments. They made him remembered, but they didn't make him loved. History loves retelling the game winners, but rarely tells the price of that precision. People applaud the result, not the process. And Reggie's process was a narrow path, where every step risked a fall. He had no privilege to fail in the final seconds. Others could miss once and be forgiven. Reggie could not, because he'd been labeled the one who doesn't miss. And that label, once broken, would turn and bite back. Loneliness in glory is a hard state to describe. It's not loud, not melodramatic. It's the feeling of standing under the lights, hearing the roar, knowing that when the lights go out, everything returns to zero. Reggie didn't seek pity. He understood the rules he'd accepted, but understanding doesn't mean relief. Every time he saved the team was one more withdrawal from his reserves. Every historic moment was a small cut into the finite time of body and mind. And while the footage lives forever, Reggie is the only one carrying the accumulated fatigue in memory. At some point he realized that clutch wasn't a moment, it was a state of being. Living in that state for years demanded a silent trade-off: less peace, less security, less support. But Reggie still stepped out there, time after time, because he knew no one else would do it for him. He wasn't carrying for anyone. He carried because if he didn't, everything collapsed. And in that carrying, a portrait slowly emerged, not of a cherished hero, but of a man who turned precision into his final refuge. Reggie Miller's glory was etched in those final seconds. Its price was etched in every morning waking up with a tired body and a tense mind. He is remembered for not shaking when it mattered most. But few ask to keep from shaking. How many years did he have to grip so tight? And in that unasked question, the loneliness of a lifetime of clutch quietly stretches on, like the sound of a ball touching net, clear, precise, then fading, leaving the shooter standing alone on the court. The 2000 NBA Finals didn't come to Reggie Miller as some belated reward, but as fate's final test. He stepped into that series with a very clear feeling that this wasn't one opportunity among many. It was the rare door that had cracked open after so many years of endurance. Across from them stood the Los Angeles Lakers, a rising empire, younger, stronger, more favored by history. At their center was Shaquille O'Neal with undeniable power, and Kobe Bryant with a burning ambition. The gap didn't need explaining. Reggie understood it from the very first minutes. To win, he would have to do something beyond the normal capacity of a man who had already reached the end of his peak cycle. There was no naivety in how Reggie entered that series. He didn't dream of miracles. He knew exactly what the Pacers faced: height, strength, depth, and a machine already primed for the throne. But because he understood so clearly, Reggie focused even more on the one thing he could control: the final minutes, the decisive shots, the moments. History is usually written by precision. In every game he ran off ball with the awareness that each stride might be his last on this stage. He shot with the caution of someone who knew a mistake wouldn't be forgiven, and he endured with the calm that had been forged through years of doubt. There were moments when the Pacers got closer than people expected. There were times Reggie made the Lakers' defense shrink back, hesitate, pay a price. But every time the opponent's power surged like an unstoppable wave. Shaq dominated the paint with cold dominance. Kobe, still young, showed the killer instinct of an era about to arrive. Reggie saw it all clearly, not with envy, but with painful understanding. History was looking for different faces. The nights passed. The score tilted toward the Lakers, not because the Pacers lacked effort, but because some limits can't be overcome with pure will. Losing in the NBA Finals wasn't a dramatic shock. It was a slow, clear, undeniable ending. Reggie had no reason to protest. He didn't blame the refs, didn't cite injuries, didn't look for excuses. When the final buzzer sounded, what he felt wasn't anger, it was heavy emptiness. He stood there, watched the opponents celebrate, and understood the door had closed. Not because he hadn't tried hard enough, but because time no longer stood on his side. There was no next time for a man who had walked through too many seasons with the same hunger. That moment carried a very particular pain. Not the pain of someone defeated in a single battle, but the pain of someone realizing the entire long journey had reached the point of no return. Reggie remembered the years of off-ball running in doubt, the clutch nights traded for exhaustion, the times he was booed and still stood tall. It all converged on one silent question: was that enough? The NBA Finals were supposed to be where history paid its debts, but history, as he was witnessing, doesn't run on emotional fairness. It picks symbols that fit the era, faces that can represent a new time, and at that fork, Reggie understood he belonged to the previous chapter. After the series, no consolation was strong enough to lighten that feeling. Teammates shared, the coach encouraged, but those words slid across the surface of an already shaped truth. Reggie knew the Pacers could come back, but he himself could not. Age, wear and tear, the years of paying the price didn't allow another loop. He walked into the locker room with the stride of someone who had fought to the very end, and left with the calm of someone who understood not every effort gets repaid with a trophy. The most painful thing about the 2000 NBA Finals wasn't the loss. It was the clear realization. Reggie didn't leave the floor in tears. He left in cold clarity, carrying the knowledge that history had chosen someone else to tell the next story. Shaq and Kobe didn't just win the series, they represented a future where Reggie no longer had a central place. He saw himself in their reflecting mirror, someone who once hungered, once endured, but now had to accept the role of witness. There was no next time. That sentence didn't need to be spoken aloud. It lived in every decision afterward, every season that passed without the finals door reopening. Reggie kept playing, kept contributing, but the 2000 NBA Finals had carved an indelible mark. It was the moment he understood his career would be remembered for the battles, not the ring, for the shots that silenced crowds, not for celebrations on the highest podium. And in that understanding, there was a very human sadness, not bitterness, not resentment, just acceptance, that sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough for history to stand on your side. Reggie Miller had reached the biggest door a player can touch, had knocked with everything he had. The door opened for a moment, long enough for him to glimpse the light inside, then closed forever. That moment didn't need dramatization. It was heavy enough to stay, like a reminder that in sports, as in life, some paths never have the ending we want. And Reggie, with all his dignity, walked away from that door without looking back, carrying a hard-to-swallow truth. History chose someone else, and he had to learn to live with it. After the 2000 NBA Finals, the road ahead for Reggie Miller didn't close in the usual sense. He could still play. His body, though worn, hadn't collapsed. His hands were still steady enough to shoot shots the entire league still respected. And more importantly, the NBA at that time was entering an era where stars could choose their own fate. Reggie could have left entirely. He could have gone to a stronger, younger team, where a championship ring wasn't a distant dream but a realistic goal. The invitations, the suggestions, the quiet conversations weren't fantasy. The whole league understood that if Reggie wanted, he could put himself in a much more favorable position than Indiana, but he didn't. The decision to stay with the Indiana Pacers wasn't made in a romantic or impulsive moment. It came from a very clear, even cold realization. This was the team that chose him when no one else wanted him, that let him exist when he was seen as a mistake, and that had witnessed his entire journey of self-proof. Reggie understood that leaving now could bring a championship chance, but it would also mean denying the very path that had made him who he was. For Reggie, a ring, if it came without the Pacers, would always carry a different aftertaste, not fake, but incomplete, and so he chose to stay. Not because the Pacers were stronger than the alternatives, but because the Pacers were where he had paid the highest price. But loyalty isn't always a quality that gets rewarded. In fact, it quickly became a burden. Every season that passed after 2000, Reggie faced the same unspoken question repeating itself, even if no one asked it outright: when is enough? The roster changed, opportunities thinned, and younger, faster, more structured opponents passed them by one after another. Reggie still ran, still shot, still carried responsibility in tough moments, but the gap between effort and results grew clearer. Loyalty at this point was no longer just a moral choice. It became an acceptance of fate. He knew every season staying with the Pacers was one more season where the chance to reach the top shrank a little further, but he stayed. Not chasing a ring was a decision that ran counter to the era itself. As more and more stars chose the easier path, chose to fit themselves into ready-made power structures to secure titles, Reggie went against the current. He didn't speak out judging anyone, didn't proclaim a philosophy. He just quietly kept walking the old road, as if loyalty was obvious, even as the price grew clearer every day. And that price wasn't just in the record books. It was in the mental fatigue of knowing he was deliberately narrowing his options, making things harder for himself, when he could have done otherwise. Reggie wasn't blind, he saw clearly what he was giving up, but that very clarity made the decision hurt more. Staying with the Pacers meant accepting that history might never stand on his side. Reggie understood perfectly how history works in the NBA. Rings create complete legends, while careers without major titles often get filed into a different drawer, told less, mentioned less. Loyalty in his case wasn't framed as a beautiful story, it was seen as impractical, even a strategic mistake. And every time the Pacers fell short at the threshold, every time a season ended in silence, that narrative got reinforced. Reggie didn't argue, he didn't try to rewrite his story with words, he just kept playing, kept enduring, as if it was the final moral duty he set for himself. Loyalty became a burden when it was no longer shared. Reggie didn't just carry a player's responsibility, he carried the symbol of a franchise that had never won a title. Every Pacers failure wasn't just a team loss, it felt like a question mark on his choice to stay, and because of that, Reggie withdrew more and more. He didn't complain, didn't seek sympathy, because he understood this was the path he'd chosen. But understanding doesn't mean relief. There were nights after leaving the floor, when the unasked question rang louder in his head than ever: if I'd left, would things have been different? History doesn't reward loyalty the way people usually hope. It records results, not motives. And Reggie Miller, in his loyalty that hurt himself, gradually realized a bitter truth: he could be respected, but not necessarily rewarded. No ring waited at the end of this road, no fairy tale ending for the one who chose to stay. But the point is, Reggie didn't retract the decision, he didn't change course at the last minute, he stayed with the Pacers all the way to retirement, like a commitment that didn't need an audience to witness. The moral tragedy of Reggie Miller isn't that he chose wrong, it's that he chose right according to his own value system, in a world that no longer values that choice. For him, loyalty wasn't a strategy to be celebrated, it was the only way to live fully with himself. But living fully doesn't mean getting paid back, and in the gap between those two things, Reggie accepted carrying the pain. He didn't win history in this choice, but history also can't say he betrayed his own path. Staying with the Pacers until the very end, Reggie Miller closed off every possibility of what if. No ring, no easy escape, just a career that went all the way to the limit of loyalty, where every passing season was a reminder that the price of not chasing the reward is learning to live with its absence. And it is precisely in that absence that Reggie's tragedy stands out clearest: a man who chose loyalty, knowing that choice would hurt him, but still accepted it, because that was the only way he could keep looking himself in the eye. The day Reggie Miller left the NBA didn't carry the shape of a triumphant march. No parade, no packed plaza of fans, no carefully prepared speeches to frame a legend. The retirement decision came as an undeniable fact that could no longer be delayed, quiet and heavy, exactly the way he had existed for most of his career. When Reggie walked off the court for the last time, there wasn't the sense that an era had just ended. It felt more like the league was ready to move on without looking back. His body was the first to deliver the verdict. The pains no longer retreated after a few days of rest. Knees ached every morning, back stiffened after long flights. The off-ball runs that once defined him now became a chain of reminders that time had won. Reggie didn't retire because he lost his love for basketball. He retired because his body was no longer honest enough to keep enduring. And in that truth, there was a sadness very hard to name. When the will is still there, but the body refuses to cooperate. There was no orchestrated farewell game to honor him, no season-long ritual. The thanks came scattered, sporadic, polite enough, but not deep enough. Reggie was used to not being favored, but even at the end, that familiarity still hurt. He looked around and realized that the faces he once battled, once got booed by, once hated, were now just memories. Younger players stepped up, faster, stronger, talked about more. The arenas kept running with the same rhythm, the same lights, as if his presence had never been a necessary condition. The feeling of being replaced didn't arrive like a shock. It came slowly, through every news report, every commercial, every discussion where his name no longer appeared. Reggie understood the mechanism perfectly. He had lived in it long enough to know the NBA doesn't wait for anyone. When you stop, the current flows past you without an apology, but understanding didn't make it lighter. There was a very human moment when Reggie realized that the clutch shots that once silenced entire arenas now existed only on tape. New games began, and the world had found others to place its faith in. No one cried with him, not because he didn't deserve it, but because life rarely pauses long enough to cry for a quiet withdrawal. Old teammates had scattered over the years. Fans shifted attention to new debates. Reggie stood at the edge, watching, and felt a strange emptiness. He had spent his whole life proving he belonged here, and when he left, no one needed proof to keep going without him. That wasn't betrayal. That was the nature of a system always facing forward. In the first days after retirement, the silence became deafening. No more practice schedules, no more flights, no more squeak of shoes on hardwood. The body still hurt, but now there was no reason to endure it. Reggie had to learn to live with the pain without a reward waiting at the end. No game tonight to justify waking up aching. No final minute to make everything worthwhile. And that revealed a deeper sadness. When you've defined yourself through endurance, stopping the endurance also means having to rediscover yourself from the beginning. Reggie didn't complain. He never had. But in the quiet of those first retired days, a silent question followed him. What did I leave behind? Not in stats, not in famous clips, but in presence. He knew he had been loyal. He knew he had pushed to the point of no retreat. But when no one cries with you, that certainty becomes fragile. You have to hold it yourself. Remind yourself that value doesn't vanish just because the applause has stopped. The arenas kept going without him, and that was an unavoidable truth. But the most painful part wasn't being replaced. It was being replaced so smoothly. No disruption, no upheaval. Reggie realized the biggest wound of retirement wasn't in the ending, but in the world's continuation. It made him understand that he had once been a part, but never the center. And for a man who had spent his life on the edge, running off ball, creating space for others, that realization was both familiar and cruel. Reggie Miller's retirement was a withdrawal in silence, just as he had walked through his entire career. No flash, no melodrama, just a man leaving the court with an aching body and a world already ready to move on. No one cried with him, but he still walked away, carrying everything that went unsaid. And in that silence, there was a very particular dignity of someone who gave everything, even when no one stayed to see him off. After leaving the court, Reggie Miller didn't step into a peaceful life the way many imagined. There was no clear transition between career and personal life, no real break to learn how to live slower. He carried the rhythm of the NBA into his private world, as if body and mind had grown used to always being tense, always preparing for a game that was never announced in advance. And in that quiet transition, silent struggles began to surface, not loud, not scandalous, but persistent and corrosive. Reggie's marriage broke down not from one big explosion, but from prolonged exhaustion. Two people walking side by side but not meeting at the same life rhythm. Years of living by game schedules, pressure, and mental isolation had shaped how Reggie existed, closed off, self-enduring, unaccustomed to sharing. When the court was no longer there to pour out energy and tension, those habits didn't disappear. They turned inward to family life. Love was still there, responsibility was still fulfilled, but closeness was missing. Not because he didn't want it, but because he didn't know how to love in an easy, light way, something his career had never taught him. Fatherhood came to Reggie in a very different state from the stories told on TV. No show, no image building, no turning private life into a message. He fathered in silence, with the same strict sense of duty he had on the court, present when needed, providing the basics, shielding his kids from excessive public attention. But because of that, Reggie kept a certain distance, safe, controlled, but not easily reachable. He didn't complain about the difficulties, didn't recount the long tiring nights. For him, speaking out was never instinct. Enduring was what felt familiar. Loneliness in Reggie's personal life didn't come from lacking people around him. It came from not knowing how to stop. Even with family, he still lived as if preparing for the next game. Always alert, always on rhythm, always afraid that if he let go, everything would collapse. His career had taught him that falling behind one beat meant being left behind, and that lesson, carried into personal life, became a burden. No one demanded he stay strong forever, but he didn't know any other way. Reggie wasn't a man of grand statements in private life. He didn't speak out to explain, didn't try to frame his story as tragedy. What happened stayed behind closed doors, but that very silence left wounds with no outlet. When the marriage ended, there were no public attacks, no public attempts to hold on, just a cold reality. A man who had spent his life not demanding anything, finally didn't know how to ask to stay. Not learning to love easily is a quiet but persistent tragedy. Reggie knew how to commit, knew how to be loyal, knew how to endure long term. But love isn't just staying. It's also opening up. And opening up was something he was never taught, from family, from the court, or from the lifelong journey of always proving his worth. He loved cautiously, restrained, always keeping a part in reserve for defense. That was enough to survive, but not enough to heal. At an age when many start looking for rest, Reggie Miller still didn't know what rest meant. No more basketball, but the tense rhythm remained. No more public pressure, but the inner pressure never left. He kept living, working, showing up when needed, fulfilling his roles, just as he always had. But behind that performance was a long silence, where questions about happiness, about fullness, were never definitively answered. Reggie's private life wasn't a loud chain of tragedies. It was a quiet flow of things unsaid, unrested, unresolved. A man used to running to exhaustion now had to learn to stand still, but didn't know where to start. And in that quiet, his tragedy appeared clearest, not loss from mistakes, but from a lifetime spent in a defensive stance, so used to gripping tight that when he wanted to let go, it was already too late. After the NBA moved into a new rhythm, Reggie Miller gradually realized that time doesn't just take away strength, it also takes away place in collective memory. The three-point record that once defined his name, the proof of a lifetime of off-ball running, absorbing contact, shooting through hostility, was finally surpassed. That moment arrived without fanfare for Reggie, not because he didn't respect the successor, but because he understood the cold rule of progress. What was once the peak becomes a stepping stone for someone else. When the record fell, the world celebrated the future. The past, as usual, quietly stepped back. His name appeared less and less in the discussions. The rankings got updated. The highlight reels shifted focus. New numbers replaced the old ones. Reggie was still there in the archives, in the Hall of Fame, in the memory of one generation, but the league's conversation had changed its rhythm. People talked about new names with the natural excitement of their own era. And when Stephen Curry redefined long-range shooting, history got rewritten in a new language, faster, more bolder. Reggie understood that, but understanding didn't make the replacement hurt any less. What haunted him wasn't being surpassed, it was the way everything he had endured got forgotten. The new generation sees half-court shots as routine. They don't see the years when shooting threes was a gamble, a risk, something that got you labeled just a shooter. They don't see the games where every deep shot from Reggie drew hostility, boos, uncalled contact. They don't see a player who had to build space for his shot by running off ball to exhaustion, in a league that wasn't ready for that kind of basketball. When history gets boiled down to numbers, the pain of the process disappears. Reggie gradually became a footnote, a line of explanation at the bottom of the page for a bigger story. Before, back in the day, those phrases started showing up more than his name, not because he lost value, but because history always favors the present. He watched analysis shows breeze past his era, to get to the new one. He heard comparisons stripped of context. He saw clips, edited down, skipping the hardest parts, the endurance. And with every one of those moments, there was a small cut into the feeling of whether his entire life had been truly understood. The pain of being replaced isn't loud. It doesn't explode into anger. It comes like mist, slowly covering memories that were once sharp. Reggie wasn't jealous. He respected the talent, respected the evolution. But he also carried a very human question. Does anyone remember that for today to exist, Someone had to accept being doubted, hated, dismissed. Does anyone remember that progress always needs people willing to take the hits first? When a record gets erased, what's erased along with it isn't just a number, it's the story behind it. The media kept spinning. New charts appeared, new terms got invented, and Reggie, now often invited as a commentator, the one recounting the past in a calm voice, spoke precisely, analyzed sharply, never complained. But behind that professionalism was a quiet sadness, talking about a world he once fought in, while that world had moved past him. Being replaced in sports is normal, being replaced in memory is what hurts. There were nights Reggie watched old footage, not to chase glory, but to remind himself that what he did was real. The shots through hostility, the tense final minutes, the scoring runs that silenced entire arenas. He saw again a skinny man standing in the storm, refusing to back down. And he understood that no matter how history rearranges the order, those moments don't vanish, they just shift places in the shared story. Being overtaken by history isn't a moral failure, that it is an existential pain. It forces you to accept that your value no longer sits at the center. Reggie learned to live with that, not fighting, not resenting. He chose the dignity of calm, but dignity doesn't erase the emptiness when your name gets mentioned less. When kids wear new jerseys, chant new names, without knowing someone once paved the way for that style with sweat and solitude. Reggie Miller's post-NBA life, therefore, wasn't a collapse, it was a long withdrawal from the spotlight. Records got broken, fame faded, the story got shortened, but the pain of replacement stayed, like a scar that needs no bandage. He lived with it, quietly, with the understanding that history always moves on. And in that moving on, the only thing he could hold was his own truth, that before the new records were set, someone stood there, endured long enough to turn the impossible into normal. At age 60, Reggie Miller understood a simple but brutal truth: the body never forgets. No accident needed, no fateful fall required to remind him. Just time. Old pains returned in their own way, quiet and persistent, like memories that refused to leave. Mornings began with familiar stiffness, knees speaking before the will could intervene, back taut, like a rope pulled too long, shoulders heavy from years of shooting under pressure, no dramatic scars to tell about, just steady wear, the kind TV lights never captured. Reggie's body was the most honest archive of his career. It remembered the nights of off-ball running to exhaustion, the hard stops on slippery hardwood, the landings without whistles. It remembered the silent moments amid boos, when heart rate had to stay steady for the shot to arc true. Everything tallied without error, not in images, but in sensation. A twist just beyond range was enough to drag out lingering ache. One night sleeping wrong was enough to make the next morning sluggish. No one saw those things, but Reggie felt them clearer than anyone. No accident, no explosive tragedy, just erosion. And that very normalcy is what makes it terrifying. Erosion doesn't give you a moment to end it. It forces you to live with it, day after day, like an uninvited companion. Reggie learned to schedule his body, careful stretching, light workouts, rest when needed, things he never allowed himself during playing days. But even that caution couldn't erase the memory in his joints. The body doesn't understand it's over, it only understands it happened. Sometimes the pain became a whisper from the past. A quiet evening sitting still was enough for the years to rush back, the roaring arenas, the tense closing minutes, the shots released in absolute focused silence. Reggie didn't need to rewatch tape to remember. His body told that story through ache. Every pain was an annotation, every limitation a marginal note. He lived with memories no one saw, no one applauded, no one debated on TV. Those memories lived under skin, in joints, in breath. The hardest part wasn't the pain, it was understanding that the price paid was permanent. No full recovery for the years traded away, no rewind button to choose differently. Reggie had no regrets. He had accepted his path from the start, but acceptance doesn't erase consequences. It only helps you stand when those consequences knock every morning. At age 60, he knew the body would keep reminding him, even when the mind wanted to move on. and he learned to listen, not resist, not show off, just quietly adjust his rhythm around the new limits. There is a bitter paradox. The moments that made him most remembered were the ones that took the most away. The game winners, the historic scoring runs, they live forever on screens, while the price lives in the body. When viewers change channels, when commentators move to the next topic, the pain stays. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't need recognition, it just exists, like a reminder that glory is never free. Reggie learned to live slower, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Steps measured, workouts just enough, rest days respected, but even that slowness carried a quiet sadness. The body that once was the tool for his voice now became a boundary, not the boundary of age, but of years paid in advance. He understood some things wouldn't return: flexibility, endless stamina, the lightness after a win.
Oh.
In their place came patience, another quality he was forced to learn.
Ah.
At age 60, Reggie Miller didn't need anyone to confirm what he had done. His body had confirmed it instead. It carried the mark of a lifetime of unrelenting fight, of choices without shortcuts, of loyalty to the very end.
Oh.
Physical tragedy doesn't need tears. It shows in the slower way he rises, the deeper breaths, the careful consideration of every movement. And in that presence, there is an undeniable truth: the price paid is permanent. But permanent doesn't mean meaningless. Reggie lived with memories no one saw, carried them like the remainder of who he was. He didn't boast, he didn't complain, he just kept living, calm, careful, knowing each pain was proof of a life fully lived. And in the silence of a body that remembered everything, there was a very particular dignity of someone who paid in full, and still walked on, even knowing some bills never get erased. At the end of the road, Reggie Miller didn't stand before history begging to be understood, nor did he hold out his hand demanding an overlooked reward. He stood there the way he had lived his whole life, back straight, silent, and without bargaining. No call for pity, because pity is for those who want saving. Reggie didn't need saving.
Oh.
He didn't demand fairness either, because fairness in sports, just like in life, is rarely handed out according to effort. He simply affirmed one simple thing: heavy as stone, he had paid enough. Looking back at the entire journey, no chapter was written with ease. From a body born lagging behind, to a family that didn't wait for the weak, from talent doubted, to a draft day booed, from years existing in skepticism, to the nights most hated at Madison Square Garden, from clutch moments traded for exhaustion, to the NBA Finals door closing without a next time, from loyalty becoming a burden, to retirement with no one crying alongside, from a quiet private life, to a post-NBA, where records got broken and fame faded, and finally a body that remembered it all. Every chapter demanded a fee he paid in full. No shortage, no debt, no evasion. Reggie didn't try to edit the story, to make it prettier. He didn't step back to paint failures as spiritual victories. Nor did he step forward to demand history look again. He understood history doesn't work on emotion. It picks faces that fit the era, symbols easy to tell, neat endings. And sometimes, it walks past people who did everything right, and still weren't chosen. That understanding didn't make Reggie bitter. It made him clear-eyed. Clear-eyed not to mistake lacking a ring for lacking worth. Clear-eyed not to equate being chosen with being deserving. In the silence of age 60, when the body answers for every stat sheet, Reggie saw clearly what had happened. He wasn't defeated by an opponent, but by timing. Not because he lacked courage, but because the era had turned the page. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because history needed different faces to tell the next story. Realizing that required a different kind of courage. The courage to accept without begging. The courage to stand firm without needing an audience to confirm it. For American audiences, this story isn't a warning, nor is it a moral lecture. It's a quiet mirror. In a culture that worships winners, Reggie reminds us that some lives are built on endurance, not on the highest podium. That loyalty isn't always rewarded, but betraying yourself always comes at a cost. That glory can fade from the screen, but the price paid stays in the body, in the habits, in the way a man gets up every morning and keeps living. Reggie didn't ask history for pity, because he understood pity blurs the truth. The truth is he chose the hard road and walked it to the end. He didn't demand fairness because he knew fairness isn't a prerequisite for living right. Living right sometimes just means not taking the easy turn when you could. And he didn't need an apology from the era, because he had signed his choice long ago, signed in sweat, in solitude, in nights that demanded absolute precision. Perhaps what is most worth honoring in Reggie Miller isn't in the replays, but in the way he closed. No noise, no demands, no call for a more prominent place. He let the story stand on its own weight. Let anyone who needs it bend down and pick up the lesson that fits them. The lesson about doing everything right and still not being chosen, about staying loyal to your values in a world that prefers shortcuts, about paying the full price and not asking for a receipt. When the lights go out, Reggie doesn't disappear, he just steps out of the spotlight. And sometimes, stepping out of the spotlight is the only way to keep your full dignity. He didn't win history by the common measure, but he didn't break either. He stood in the exact shape of a man who lived his choices to the fullest. No pleading, no resentment, no rewriting the ending. Just walking on slower, more careful, carrying memories no one saw and pains that don't need to be told. Some men don't lose, they are simply never chosen by history. And in the space between losing and being chosen, Reggie Miller built a career and a life that didn't need anyone's permission to have meaning. The story of Reggie Miller leaves behind a very particular sadness in American sports culture, the sadness for those who did everything right but weren't favored by history. Throughout the journey told, from a child born with hip dysplasia who had to learn to walk while others ran, to an NBA player booed on draft day, Reggie always lived in the state of having to prove himself without ever being trusted by default. He grew up in a family where winning was the standard, placed next to the brilliant shadow of Cheryl Miller, learning to swallow tears very early. That detail explains why later, when doubted at UCLA, labeled just a shooter, or forced to exist in skepticism in the NBA, Reggie didn't fight back with words but with relentless endurance to exhaustion. His greatest pain wasn't losing to the Lakers in the 2000 NBA Finals, but the moment he understood that was the last chance, that history had chosen other faces. He could have left the Pacers to chase a ring, but he stayed and accepted his fate, turning loyalty into a burden he carried himself. When he retired, no parade, no collective tears, the arenas kept going without him. That was the quietest tragedy. Later, when the three-point record was broken and his name faded, Reggie became a historical footnote, while his body at age 60 still remembered every year of off-ball running and endurance. The lesson for Americans from this story is very clear and very real. Society celebrates winners, but real life is full of people who weren't chosen even after paying the full price. Success doesn't always come with deserved reward, and the value of a life shouldn't be measured only by the final trophy or title. As Reggie Miller showed, dignity lies in not breaking under adversity, in living fully with your choices, even when history turns away. If the story of Reggie Miller makes you pause and rethink how we define success in life, hit subscribe to keep joining the channel for the next deep stories. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video where we continue listening to the fates history didn't choose, but that never fell.